what is the smallest possible thing we can do? Not what is the biggest to solve climate change. What is the smallest thing? Not even, I'm going to recycle. What is the smallest thing I can do? And then think, okay, I've got an idea. Can I do a smaller version of that? And you chunk it all the way down, and suddenly it's not about a series of steps. It's about this attitude of there are points at which the smallest thing I can do can only happen with other entities involved.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Craig Slee. Craig is a disabled writer, consultant, and theorist dealing with mythology, folklore, magic, and culture. He explores life through the lens of landscape, disability, and fugitive embodiments. And he joined me today to discuss how we can modulate how we think together, both with each other, with our bodies, and with the Earth's wider body. This is a really beautiful conversation that I'm so delighted to present you all with. It is poetry, it is emergent, it is hopeful and realistic and grounded, and also fluid and permeable. And these are all the themes that we weave through together. We discuss the proprietorial nature that we have towards our own emotions and even suffering, and how this lends into the capitalist enclosure of the world, that things are mine and that my body is impermeable, that I am invincible, and how this ableist perception, this patriarchal mode of organizing one another and subjugating more marginalized groups to one group's perspective, permeates how we think about the climate crisis, how we think about solutions, how we think about thinking, and how we think about our own bodies. This is a conversation about language coming from the throat, about the artificial divisions between the world of words and the world of our bodies. It's about inviting in the reality that we are shaped by the world, about learning how to do the smallest thing, and about how learning when we are confronted with the possibility that maybe there is nothing that we can do, we begin by learning how to do the smallest thing. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Craig, welcome to the show. My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
Ooh, yeah. Okay, so I hope your listeners will forgive me here because I'm going to take a little bit of a indirect route.
Please do.
Because I keep thinking about when you posited this question, I've been thinking about crisis as a concept. And one of the interesting things about, crisis, as probably everybody knows, is it's synonymous with a turning point. But maybe or a decision, a point of a decision. But what many people, I think, aren't aware of is the idea that crisis came to prevalence in early medical literature. So we're talking about Hippocrates, Galen, all the ancient Greek, fathers of medicine, as it were. And it was used to describe that point in a disease where the person either died or recovered, right? And I think that this is actually one of the big, interesting roots of our problem when describing crises as turning points, because inbuilt into that is a kind of binary of it's broken or it's fixed, or you live or you die. And we saw this really strongly during the pandemic, which is still ongoing, but at its peak, where people were saying, oh, it's fine if I get COVID because I'll either just recover or I'll die. I'm okay with that. They didn't think about the mass disabling aspects of the disease. They didn't think that there was another, alternative, that this disease you can have it and it can affect your life long term, which anybody with, say, chronic illness or post-viral fatigue will be like, actually, things can reach out and they can influence you, they can change your life. And one of the interesting things I find about the question of why is the world in crisis is this notion that we are distinct individuals with fixed barriers. Things aren't interlinked. They're a system of almost Newtonian mechanisms, right? They're cogs in a machine. We don't, as a culture, in at least the so-called West, really think about the interdependency that is ongoing and the permeability of that interdependency and the in-betweenness between those binaries. So we're not, as a disabled person, which I am, I was born disabled. People don't, even talking about disability, most people, if you're thinking about consequences of, say, climate change, increasing disability, or pollution, they will be like, oh, it could cause birth defects and so on and so forth, or pollution could, cause health problems for, people next to polluting industries or so on and so forth. They don't think about the notion that there are other ways of existing in the world. We literally, when lockdown hit in 2020, I'm mostly housebound, and a lot of people that I knew were absolutely freaking out, going, how do I exist in my house? I can't do this. My mental health is taking a dip. And I'm sort of sitting here going, well, I ended up writing a thing which was basically, this is how you survive when you can't get out your house. This is how you maintain your mental health. Don't do this, do that, so on and so forth. And this is, again, one of the things that I think is deeply important, as we were discussing before, this ability to think with other people outside of your own domain and experience, whether that be, somebody of different, gender identification or racial identification, or even just economic situation. This, real idea that because we have these identifiers, we're separate, rather than seeing where we actually are, well, not connected, but where we both have relation in commons, shall we say. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of sort of covering the basics.
I love that we have relations in common. That's
yeah. Although technically it's commons in the old traditional way of the commons, but yes, relations in common.
I think that I was writing about this morning. The threads that hold us together and keep us apart are that which create reality. And we know this on like a quantum level now, after a team of physicists in 2022 won the Nobel Prize for proving that the universe is non-locally real. So that objects are impacted by things out with their environment and that they don't have definite material properties. There's this notion of fluidity and permeability, as you said. And so it is through navigating and deepening and changing and creating new relations that we begin to change the very fabric of reality. And I think everything that you're speaking to is relevant as to how we have all of the science about what is going on with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the water crisis, the ecological crisis, essentially the poly crisis, and why, despite all the numbers and the figures and the models, things aren't actually changing. The solutions on offer aren't going to fundamentally change because they're not addressing our relationship to the planet, our relationship to other bodies, our relationship to our own bodies. They're denying essentially what it is to live in this world and to invite lived experience as part of the equation of how we seek to make sense of reality.
Yeah. And I would also say that the interesting thing, and obviously you've interviewed Bio Akamalafe before, he put us in touch. His, thesis of looking for the cracks and the breaks is very important to me as a disabled person when I'm looking at all the things that get said about, the negative aspects of disability or all these other things about the breaks of climate change and, pollution, all these things which are, ascribed negative value because they do either they appear to be harmed or do harm, right? And there is this interesting thing with solutionism, which, I definitely feel at the sharp end of disability, where people are like, oh, you have a disability, we've got to fix you, we've got to cure you, we've got to deal with that, we've got to make you the perfected ideal, whatever that is. And this is a problem within the, medical community. And this is, and a whole other things, and I could go on for hours about the potentially oppressive ways that the medical complex can do things to various bodies, but that's not particularly germane. The point that I'm trying to make here is that our tendency to seek solutions to divide the world into, well, this is a good thing. We fixed it. We fixed the climate change, or we've made climate change worse. Is a kind of a replication of a habit that runs throughout the entirety of our society. And I'm not saying we shouldn't seek solutions, but when we're thinking with situations, sometimes it helps to take any sort of, if we can, just for a moment to take the moral dimension out. So this is not what I'm saying here is a lot of people will be like, oh, there's nothing wrong with being disabled. You should be proud of being disabled or having, whatever condition that makes you, marginalized, whether you should be proud of being black or being queer or whatever, because, that's a way of fighting back. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But what if you just take out even pride and just say being queer or disabled is just a thing that happens in the world? There are people with this. It's not good. It's not bad. It exists. And what does that mean? And the same with the climate crisis, where people are like, oh, people will become sick. People will die. We should fix that. Yeah, totally agree. Right? But let's look at why we're saying that. And if the idea is let's try to ameliorate suffering, then I'm totally up for that. But if it's because somebody's saying, "Oh, I don't want to exist as a disabled person. I don't want to exist as a sickened person. I can't handle that," then there is some really interesting, deep-seated societal programming that is going on that is stopping us thinking in different ways. So, as an example, if we're sitting here at climate change in a particular situation and we're saying, "Oh, it means that I can't, work an 8-hour workday, or I can't take care of my kids because I'm exhausted or sickened or something. That's not good for me." Okay, fair enough. Maybe you should ask people who are already under those conditions and see how they live and how they manage to make their life worth living for them, right? And when you start talking to them, when you start exploring how they live their lives under conditions that they can't change, then you start to learn not ways, but perhaps attitudes that might help you to be like, okay, well, I as a person can't help the fact that, the temperature is now killing people in the summer because they dehydrate, or or because they get heat stroke, or because they're forced to labor. This whole notion of looking at things that are broken or don't work as they're supposed to, and treating them as not bad or good, but merely another thing to consider as a way of existing, is something I think we're missing with our immediate leapfrogging to solutionism, right? And that means, unfortunately, that sort of contemplation and that sort of thinking is slow. It takes time and repetition of encounter. So, this is the first time we're actually speaking, me and you. But if I really wanted to think with you long term about projects, we'd have to have multiple conversations. But we'd have to do it in such a way where we're not even setting agendas, right? We're just thinking together with no particular goal other than encountering each other and building relation and sharing experience. But because of I think perhaps the capitalist framework of focusing on production, that's infected how we think about everything in the world, which means we're suddenly like, we need a solution. If that makes any sort of sense to you and your listeners.
Oh, yeah, totally. I've got so many different things sparking off right now. And if you're up for it, I'd like to try something different, actually. I'd really like to try thinking with you. Because the word that is coming to me as you're speaking is passion, and passion from the root, suffering. And I know that there's a thought here, and I would love for you to help me unwind it, unravel it together.
Or at least get lost and more entangled in it, which is always the
more
option.
entangled. I think where the bits of it that are coming through to me now are everything you're saying about the capitalist mode of production, the patriarchy mode of organization, the medical complex, the moral judgments of good or bad. That speaks to a desire to control and identify and organize and subjugate. And then this unwillingness to accept suffering in our own body, and thus put it onto other people by being unwilling to look at that relationship and how perhaps our body causes suffering, is also about control, and how and something to do with Christ dying on that cross in passion for suffering, and perhaps there being a lack of framework in this, as you said, quote unquote, Western world, that there is passion in suffering, there is meaning in suffering, and that there is a lot to be gleaned from those who know how to suffer, and not just make meaning of it in the sense of, you know, people have to polish the silver of their trauma or their identity or their disability for others. But as you said, that there is such meaning in a diversity of experience, and those who have suffered may indeed be able to turn to the world and say, we can help you through this next bit, because it is coming and it is already here because it has been with us for so long.
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things about, you know, the passion in both the Christian framework and our ideas of suffering is that there is almost, for me, a tendency for us to forget that, again, in our society, we say, you know, I am suffering, right? I am suffering, this is happening, rather than suffering has come upon me, right? So we have internalized this and made a property, personal property, an enclosure of suffering, right? And I am in no way saying that suffering, as popularly discussed, is a good thing. But I think in the context of what you're talking about here, what we understand as passion is this really interesting quirk of how we perhaps, in a more modern framework, process emotional and biophysical content as solely coming from internal. So we say some of the older, even the medieval Western way of saying is, you know, they might talk about our depression as the noonday demon, right? Where there's something outside ourselves that is acting upon us and through us, right? And this idea of almost a human supremacy, so an anthropocentric supremacy, where the human is this constructed idea of the self, this group which we all are told you want to be part of, because if you're not human, you'll get, you know, abused or treated like animals. You know, we can see this in a lot of the discussion where either in fascism you refer to the outgroup as animals, or, you know, the way that the writer and philosopher Sonora Taylor talks about the linkages between the way we treat animals and the way we treat disabled people, you know, as lesser. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because if we consider that, again, to use the exemplar of the passion, is that the suffering, you know, comes upon Christ on the cross, right? God, the Father, in that theology, says, and now you suffer for the world, right? You die for the world. And that is outside of Christ the man, right? That's the point where the more than human intersects with our lives. And so when you say, you know, people who have suffered may be able to help, there is this interesting concept that if you take suffering as somehow being made contact with by the more than human, by the thing that exceeds the human, whether that be, you know, economic stress or, you know, racial oppression. Yes, some of those things were created by humans, but they've become more than human. They've exceeded individual belief systems and have become structures. But at the same time, those things are also akin to things like, you know, I have suffered because my crops have failed, right? And we have this tendency in the modern West to be like, oh, that's just religious belief. That doesn't cut. We're a secular society, or so on and so forth. And any talk of the more than human is either esoteric, complex philosophy, or religious,
Mm.
right? But if you look at plenty of, indigenous cultures, and I'm not holding them up as perfected, because they are also inflected with colonialism.
Mm.
You can't get away from that. But the admission that there are forces outside of the very narrow human sphere. So when you say, the coronavirus was more than human, right? The more than human came upon us, and it changed us for at least 4 years peak. It changed how we worked. It changed how we socialized, right? Humans didn't do that. We reacted to it, but there was something outside of us which came upon us, which caused us to have to look at the world differently as, there is something more than us, not better, just outside of our sphere of control. And there is a tendency when we're talking about, as you said, talking about solution, that it is about control. And one of the things that I had to learn as a disabled person, and this took me years, this isn't something you get as a package, is that it's not just there are some things you can't control. It's that actually even the idea of control is kind of toxic. And so you have to sit here and go, okay, what do I have instead of this idea of controlling and grasping? And I look at myself, and for those who are watching the video, you can see I'm holding a mug here. But part of my disability is that I get muscle spasms, right? So I'm drinking my tea, and occasionally I might have a muscle spasm, which will cause me to spill it. I can't control that. I only know a split second before it's going to happen. And sometimes that means if I'm drinking a hot mug of tea, it can be quite dangerous and quite painful if I spill it on myself. But that's part of life. There are things that happen to my body and my nervous system that I am not in control of, that I can never be in control of. The best I can do is modulate it. The best I can do is look at it and go, okay, that's going to happen. So how do I work with what's actually happening? What's actually going on, rather than moving away from it to some imagined future. And I deal with chronic pain a lot. So there are times when I am sat here and the best thing in the world would be I want to not be here. I want to not be in this body in pain. But there's nothing I can do about that. So I have several choices, one of which is to try and ignore it, which long term doesn't really work, and can sometimes cause more damage as you're pushing through when your body's saying, actually, dude, no, don't do this, the second choice is to literally sit with my pain as almost an entity and say, okay, what are we doing here? And sometimes the pain is so strong that I can't even think, right? And it's just a case of, well, I hope this passes when I can think and relate again. And that's not to, sometimes that happens, and I accept that happens. And I am not saying, for example, people should go off their meds to fully experience their pain or their suffering, shouldn't take not in a million years, but understanding that even with these interventions, there are still some processes that come upon us and move through us. And so the question I often ask, and I ask in these sort of spaces, is what happens when we can't do anything,
Mm.
right? What happens when we're confronted with climate change? And rather than despairing in the sense of, oh, there's nothing we can do, you actually go, okay, there's nothing I can do. So the terms of reality as are being given to me, I actually have to say, okay, I don't accept, or there is a loophole somewhere. And I have to go through the attitude of going, I have to find that loophole. I might not find that loophole. I might not find that crack, as Bio would say, but I have to go looking for it. And that means I have to relate to these things that come upon me, these things, these passions that come upon me, and look at them and say, okay, you exist, I exist. I can't get rid of you. Believe me, I've tried, and you come back, right? And this is an interesting thing for me, and also why my, angle of things is looking at myth and story as well as disability is this notion. There's a folklorist called Claude Lecoteau, and the English translation of the book he has in this is called Demons and Spirits of the Land. And one of these things about this book is he's talking about the folklore of folks moving into new areas in the medieval period. And some of this folklore, he says, oh yeah, they usually when people went into an area pre-Christian eras, there would be this, they'd have to negotiate with what he calls the master of the animals or the spirit of the place. And usually, he says in this folklore, and I'm compressing, one of the things that is done is you kind of drive the spirit out. You say, no, this is my place now. But you also acknowledge that it's going to come back, right? And so you have to then negotiate with the returning master of the animals or the spirit to make it into something that relates to your new domestic sphere, right? But with Christianity, when it came in the medieval period, and we can see this in a lot of the things with the saints would drive out these spirits, whether it be St. Patrick's and the snakes and all these other sort of motifs. The saints would drive it out and be like, no, this is God's place now, you can't come in, right? And that whole attitude of erecting this non-permeable barrier, right? For me, that ties into ideas of everything we're talking about, both in terms of capitalist enclosure, of land, and but also bodies. So this idea that we are a body that has a barrier, and anything that gets into that is bad. And whether that be, oh no, we don't want the vaccine because it might mess me up, or this notion that oh, the guy who Peter Hesketh, the guy who Trump has nominated for his defense secretary. I saw this today. He has this whole thing where he's literally said, that he hasn't washed his hands in 10 years because germs aren't real, because he inoculates himself. He's healthy, and germs don't exist because he can't see them, and he hasn't washed his hands in 10 years, which is classic, fascist. It's disgusting, but it's also classic fascist strongman sort of disease can't stop me. It can only stop you degenerates and dysgenic folks who we really should clean up with eugenics or kill, right? And this notion of the body as this inviolate, entity, is really interesting because it's the body and the land and capitalist production all interlinked with this idea of enclosure that should not be able to suffer. That's the ultimate goal, a sufferingless, untouchable reality, right? Which everybody's perfect and you could do whatever you like without consequence or entanglement. This is the ableist ideal, where you can do anything you want without any sort of restriction. This is the billionaires. I have $1 billion, so I can do whatever the hell I like. It's all interlinked to this idea of not being, not being penetrated or keeping that boundary intact, and not allowing other things to exist, except by the way that you desire them to. And in the context of passion and a lot of these other things, older ways of looking at this are like, even in the West, we don't have to go to, indigenous cultures and steal off them. We can look at our own myths and our own stories and be like, actually, there was another ontology here. There literally was another way of looking at emotions as, some weird hybrid between, or experiences between, external and internal. And what does that do if we accept that we are merely, one entity in a horde of experiences that is ongoing? What does that do to even our thinking about solutions? And what does it do when we say, oh, I'm feeling, I'm experiencing this passion, but also being able to sit there and go, yeah, but I'm not sure this passion belongs to me. It might also be something from my ancestors, from my grandparents, from their upbringing. That question of we assume what I'm feeling is generated by me in reaction.
It's mine.
Yeah, it's my pain, it's my suffering. And it's this really interesting concept of, what if you start thinking of them as not yours, but other things acting on you, whether they're histories or landscapes or whatever. So when passion comes up, when these things come up, I'm like, yeah, okay. There's a different framework here somewhere.
That is beautiful, and I love it. And I want to tell you a couple of images that were formed by your words. So when you were talking about, the impermeable body and COVID being a more than human thing, I was thinking about a human body draped over the entire planet, enclosing it. But in doing so, it has its back to everything else, and it has turned its back because it thinks that nothing else exists, because everything that it exists is everything that it contains. And so these other things come through us like spirits, essentially, because we don't expect them. And when we don't invite them in, when we don't make relationship to them, that as well is when we can be hijacked by them or identify with them or try to claim them. Even this idea of like making proprietorial these things, these passions or emotions, it's another form of enclosure. It's like, well, if you're mine, then I can control you and I know what you are and I can identify you. And then the other thing that came up for me was this idea, and this is going to be another one I'm going to ask you to think with me. Or actually, hopefully hand it over and listen to you think. Was this idea of, if the body is impermeable, then I don't have to guard it. And if I don't have to guard it, then I don't have to be in it. And I can exist in the realm of words, in the mind, where I am invincible, where I am exactly as I wish to be, where my reactions to things are what I also not choose them to be, as in because I can modulate, as you said, which is a word I massively prefer to regulate. It's the first time I've heard it. But because I always seek control. And I've been thinking a lot in my work about this necessity of coming back into the body, and more recently about how coming back into the physical body that I inhabit can also now be a way to understand the Earth's body and other bodies and the more than human world and these forces that move between us. And so I guess where I'd like to dance into, if possible, is going beyond what I said, which was, inviting people to share a diversity of experiences in which we can learn from one another. But how is it that we do what you just said, like go into that body, go into our own, and from that, finally accept that the biggest organ that we have is our skin. So we are kind of inside out and we are constantly out in the world and having the world through us. And if the world is constantly moving through us, how can we begin to use this thing that feels quite defined to inhabit everything all at once and begin to feel it?
So, I mean, this is an interesting thing, and one of the experiments that I like to play with, and is I'm kind of obsessed with etymology of language, right? I'm absolutely obsessed with the roots of words and the ways that meanings shift, but sometimes root contexts are buried within,
Totally.
what we use in everyday
Like clues.
context. And so when we, I write things and on a variety of ways, and when I'm sort of sat here and going, oh, my head is full of words, one of the things that I remember, or try to remember, is that every word, even if it's written down, originally was composed of a sound, right? And every one of those sounds is made by a throat, right? So everything that I am doing now, even though I am using words, is my body being transmitted through the speakers across the digital divide to come through your speakers into your ears, right? So there is this really interesting division we have, in a way, which is kind of artificial, between the world of ideas and the world of the body, right? And yet, when you collapse that divide, you can do something really interesting, which is you can start to look at language and words as something that arises and moves through the body. Okay? And we all have bodies with a variety of experiences and sensory organs. Some people are blind, some people are deaf, some people have, neurodivergence, which means that they're sensitive to certain things. All of these things, which are regarded as mental and neurological, and this is another thing, the obsession we have with everything is in the brain, right? Is one of the biggest issues, and one of my bugbears is prefixing everything with neuro. But anyway, the point being there that when we're looking at the people say, oh, words are beautiful, but it's just poetry, right? And I look at my education in the UK schooling system and the way we got exposed to the poets of the Second and First World War. I look at what's going on in Gaza and the poets that are moved to write about the Gazan people being like, I have to write poetry about this. And the reason for this is not because it's an intellectual exercise, but because it comes from the body, right? And poesis is a bringing forth, right? And so when we're talking about language, we have this idea that it's outside us, or we're in these fields of language. But actually, what all we're doing as an experiment, I'm not saying this is literally true, but as an experiment to sort of encounter your body and you, think about the ways in which, as you're writing notes now, your body is shaping the way you're holding the pen. But rather than also saying, I'm holding the pen, understand that the pen is also holding you, right? The pen is also shaping your posture, right? So there's an interplay between, again, what we view as internal and external, right? And so when we're thinking about embodiment, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be like, oh, everything is somatic and wonderful and blah, 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 blah. We can really take it down into this context of, okay, I need to notice what my body is doing, right? At the smallest level. I have this exercise which I do and I teach a little bit, which is a cut down version of a larger one, and we don't have time to do either of them now. But one of the things that I try to get people to do is to spend 10, 15 minutes being absolutely still. Literally absolutely still. Not moving anything, apart from breathing, swallowing and blinking. And pay attention to what is moving in their body, in spite of them trying to remain absolutely still, right? And they'll find, usually, that things like, they'll become aware of their guts, or, their heartbeat, or these things like that. And this, for a lot of people, I have found and been told, is a good door to be like, actually, the majority of my activity is completely, that I consider as mine, is completely involuntary. And so when we're talking about the realm of ideas as well, it's interesting to consider how many of our ideas are involuntary expressions of our own bodies. So how much is the idea of enclosure actually, a construction of something else coming in going, oh, I don't want to be gripped, but it feels good to grip, right? How much of that idea of enclosure is literally down to the way it hits that sweet spot when we know we've got a firm grip on something, right? And this is how it affects our language, right? Perception, the word itself, if you trace the etymology, it's grasping, right? It's, again, all of these things are buried in an experiential thing. They're not like some airy-fairy platonic thing. These are literally, our language is us just conveying embodied experience through sound. So it's bodies talking about bodies with bodies, right? And so thinking like that, it also means, okay, combine that with the idea that maybe and this is a dangerous thing to say, and I'll say it here, and it might get me a lot of flack, but what if our bodies, for all I support bodily autonomy, what if our bodies were actually never ours completely, right? What if they were also, and obviously oppressed populations, women and the like, there's history of other people coming and oppressing bodies, white people oppressing, non-white bodies. But there is also this notion of, what if my hand is not entirely my hand? What if my hand is also part of this conversation and it's not my hand? So there is this big question that when people say to me, "Oh, what you're saying is airy and has nothing to do with material reality," my response just basically boils down to, maybe you're not experiencing material reality completely, because you're sat in a room right now, Rachel, and there's other stuff going on. There are air currents, there are all kinds of things, temperature rises and falls, which you, as a intact individual, have nothing to do with. But if you're not thinking like an intact individual, but a physical field, right? Back to the quantum physics, you are affecting the room, so that the observer is not your consciousness in the quantum physics term, but the actual technical idea of an observer in quantum physics is simply something that affects a system, right? So you don't even have to be woo about this, right? You can actually say, this thing affects a system in this way, right? And so if we're all composed, if we're all an interlinking of these embodied fields, these material fields, that means that the world of ideas is actually not some idealist realm, but actually a material realm, right? And that is quite terrifying, because we're suddenly sitting here going, but I just wrote a thing. And you're like, well, why did you write a thing? Because you actually wanted people to read it, and you actually wanted them to experience something bodily. But because we've separated it into intellectual, we don't think about the bodily responses and interactions that we have with these ideas. And if we start thinking that way, then we start wondering, well, if we can change language, maybe we can change, or not change our bodies, but maybe we can change how we react to them. Maybe I don't want enclosure anymore. Maybe I want gesture. Maybe I want, there's a writer and poet, deafblind writer and poet called John Lee Clark. And he's written a whole bunch of essays on this language that deafblind people have developed called protactile, which basically involves a whole bunch of deafblind folks using each other's bodies to communicate. So they're tapping words out on each other's bodies.
Wow.
Right? And with each other's bodies. So it's not I'm speaking solo, it's I can't talk without your body. Right? And that, to me, is deeply interesting, because that's actually what we're actually doing, just made more obvious. Right? Because we're doing it right now. Like I said, my body is talking to your body across the distance. Across here, it's mediated, of course. But if we think about, if somebody insults you, or trolls you, or says an unpleasant thing, and no matter how much we ignore it, we're still assuming a posture of ignoring it. So we're still reacting even though we're not reacting. There is nothing, doing nothing, they say doing nothing is a choice, right? But if you sit there and go, okay, what if there's nothing we can do, and not be passive about that, but actively say, what if there's nothing you can do? Actively doing nothing. What does that do? What does that allow us to perceive about our bodies and the world? That's, you could say, oh, it's meditation, just watching what happens. And that's the real thing for sensing with, is this notion that, yeah, stuff's ongoing all the time. We just have to follow it and see where it leads. And it might not lead to a particular goal, but just paying attention in the same way that I would pay attention to the way you're nodding and your facial expression right now is me actually, I'm trying and failing, because failing is part of the thing as well, to a different degree, to literally say, I don't know what I'm saying now, right? I'm talking to you and your listeners are hearing it, and I don't know what I'm saying. And this is not because I'm making it up off the top of my head. It's because this stuff is coming out of my embodiment, my life experience, and my response to your, you know, facial expression on the screen. I'm not in control of this, because if I was, I could do this with my eyes closed and you wouldn't have to be there, right? But you are there. You are always, your presence, even when you are saying nothing, is affecting what is being said and how we're communicating. And that is a really interesting quirk, because it suggests that we can do stuff with such low energy, for want of a better word. We can change the world literally in small ways with minimal energy expenditure, purely by sitting with, right? And relating in a different way. And as a disabled person, I have limited energy. There's a metaphor the disability community uses of spoons. Some days I'm just out of spoons because I've spent them all doing things. So we develop this way of, what's the way that I can get maximum, interaction, maximal experience with minimal energy expenditure, right? How can I do this interview in such a way that I can not tire myself out talking or exacerbate my pain because I've been sat in one position, right? All of these things run in my head as things that I have learned. But the attitude themselves is, what is the smallest possible thing we can do, right? Not what is the biggest to solve climate change. What is the smallest thing? Not even, I'm going to recycle, right? I'm going to recycle, which we know now is dodgy in so many ways. But the way in which, what is the smallest thing I can do? And then think, okay, I've got an idea. Can I do a smaller version of that? Right? And you chunk it all the way down, right? And suddenly it's not about a series of steps. It's about this attitude of, okay, there are points at which the smallest thing I can do can only happen with other entities involved, right? I can only get out of bed. I'm hoisted out of bed, right? So I have two hands here, but actually, in order to talk to you today, it took 6 hands to get me out of bed this morning. I couldn't do that without the extra 4. So the question then becomes, these aren't my hands. There are 6 hands that got me out of bed, right? And so there's these externalities which are always, at least in my head, which I look at the world and go, what else is here? Or who else is here? And that helps me with relation and politics of relation. Because if it's not just me here, well, then there's other options.
You know what came to mind just then was that moment when Kamala Harris was doing her campaign, in front of, a huge audience on the campaign trail in, I can't remember which state, and a protester shouted out about the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and she said, "I'm speaking." And how it was heralded as this, empowered moment.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I mean, I didn't like it at the time, although I couldn't quite put my finger on it, apart from the obvious of please don't shut people up when they're protesting. But if I think about that, and then I think about how Trump campaigned with his weave, just saying whatever, whenever, to whoever, neither candidate allowed themselves to be in relationship with the world. They came with a script, and I understand you do have to write speeches, but they had no interest in permeability, and thus in being in the world as it is. And that perhaps is the thing that binds them, and perhaps why a lot of people are feeling increasingly disenfranchised about this world of politics, because that world of politics is not holding a relationship to them whatsoever. And the world needs to change, and that was a real moment, I think, for Harris, that she failed to grasp, and she failed to do the smallest thing then to change the world. Because if she had allowed that comment to be in the room rather than shutting it down, that's not the same as negotiating a ceasefire or promising to negotiate a ceasefire. All of these things that she couldn't accept to do beyond, we just want to bring the hostages home. But that could have been a small thing right there to welcome in a different reality. And that was what I thought of. And I thought of a lot of things while you were speaking. But just at the end there, that was what was brought up for me.
And I think as well, it's important to note that, when I talk about changing the world, I I don't like to use that phrase, and yet I used it, which is another failure on my part, which is good, because the fact is that we can't change the world without the world already changing us, right? Because this, again, we've got to be careful with the pitfalls of anthropocentrism here. We're the ones changing the world. Are we? Or are we actually in concert with all the other agencies involved?
Yeah.
Everything that we do in terms of, as Bio has been saying, is about, there are other entanglements involved, and so every bit of care we produce, that we do, has harm inside it in a particular context, right? And we can't control all of those contexts. So when we understand that we can't control all these contexts, we start to become alert for the ways in which things that we perhaps didn't consider might occur. We have a problem in the West, again, going back to the climate models, where we're like, the model says this, right? It should act like this. We have total, almost panopticon knowledge of this particular thing. Okay. But what if we don't? What if there are possibilities we're not seeing because we're so sure of that outline, of that again, that enclosure? And so Harris was there as, I'm the politician. That protester was, I'm there as a protester, right? And they were there as those people, those identities, those figures. But they were also there with every other one of those. And sometimes when we're not able to connect from politician to protester, maybe we should abandon, or at least put to one side, those ways of relating and be like, okay, I can't relate to you as a politician or a protester. What can I relate to you as? Well, I can relate to you as a body. I can relate to you as a fellow body, as a fellow experiencer of certain things. And this is not to be like, oh, I'm just going to dismiss political or social issues. This is to say there is a commons, again, a commons of embodiment, which we can connect with, even if our embodiments are non-normative or different. There are certain points in all of these things which are similar, not identical. There's never anything that's identical, never anything that's repeated. That's again one of those things that repetition doesn't actually exist. Comes close, but it doesn't actually exist because the context is constantly shifting. Right? So I can say the same word 1,000 times and everyone says, well, Craig, you're saying the same word 1,000 times. The world is different every single time I say that word. So the word is technically different. And people say, oh, you're splitting hairs. But that hair splitting is the crack. Because you're like, okay, if you get into the split hair, then you're into camel of the eye of the needle territory in the positive way. Because you're like, okay, if a split hair exists, what ways does that change things? And it helps for me, at least as a disabled person, when I'm considering the what if I can't do anything, to look at it and go, okay, if I can't do anything, something is happening anyway. My job is to notice what's happening as much as I can, knowing I will fail, and just embracing that as the attitude and seeing what comes up, what shows up. And in my experience, and I'll use this word very technically, wonders show up. It's not just the unexpected. It is literally things I never would have thought would have appeared and shown up happen once I'm like, okay, I have to lean into my limitations, right? And that's the big thing for me that disability has taught me is, rather than avoiding my limitations, lean into them and lean into them hard and see what happens.
Craig, thank you for such a beautiful conversation. I really appreciate it. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I would love for you to talk to a good friend of mine, Damien Patrick Williams. He is a Black scholar working in the field of science, technology, and society. But what I think he should be known for is his background of dealing with technology from his religious studies background. So he is an expert in dealing with AI, machine learning, and stuff. But his PhD thesis is about the beliefs and values we have around our technology. So it's not about whether it's good or bad. His work on AI, his thesis, traces the way the Western world relates its spiritual and religious relation to non-human entities, and how, as an example, we use our email, and our email uses things that are named mailer demons, right? And all these things are carried in, all these biases and assumptions are carried in from our language, our histories, and our social belief, and how they're actually affecting the production of our technologies today.
Amazing.
So I would love for you to have a word for him, because I think he's got a really unique take on it because of that cultural aspect, rather than the, AI good, AI bad. There, it goes back a level, if
Wonderful.
you see what I mean.
I do. Craig, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Been lovely from this end too.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening, and for coming on this journey together.